Ambassador Jonathan Larson stepped forward, his polished black boots clicking against the crystalline floor. He kept his posture relaxed, his breathing measured, and his eyes scanning every shadowed alcove. His instincts, honed over decades of combat, whispered the truth before any words were spoken. This was a trap. Across from him, seated on an elevated dais, Chancellor Lorzer of the Galactic Council leaned forward, his dark violet robes cascading over the armrests of his throne-like chair. His skeletal face, framed by the bony ridges of his species, bore the trace of something Larson had seen 1,000 times before. The look of a man who believed he had already won. Larson did not react outwardly. Instead, he took another step toward the center of the chamber, placing himself in the designated speaking zone. He exuded diplomacy, controlled, restrained, unshakable. A facade carefully curated for his role as Earth's ambassador. The room was a grand architectural feat, built to reflect the might of 1,000 civilizations. Suspended in zero-gravity fields, glowing orbs of artificial suns illuminated the assembly of species, some towering and insectoid, others squat and armored in natural chitin, a few resembling spectral beings of light. The Galactic Council had long claimed to be the arbiters of order in the cosmos. Larson had always known better. He clasped his hands behind his back. "Chancellor Tarwan," he began, his voice even, "I trust that these summons were issued in the spirit of diplomacy." Tarwan's thin lips curled slightly. "Oh, Ambassador Larson, let us not pretend. You are here because Earth has become a threat, a rapidly expanding civilization, reckless, aggressive." Larson said nothing. He had faced warlords, assassins, and interstellar terrorists. He had stared down executioners with blades pressed to his throat. He had learned that silence was often more powerful than words. A ripple of unease spread among the gathered council members. A Drakvar warlord to Tarwan's right flexed his massive clawed fingers. The reptilian Skarn envoy flicked his forked tongue, tasting the tension in the air. Tarwan's smile widened. "The council has come to a decision." He gestured subtly, and the chamber's massive doors sealed shut with an audible thud. Guards moved from the shadows, Skarn soldiers clad in segmented battle armor, their rifles trained on him. Energy turrets descended from hidden recesses in the ceiling. The delegates, one by one, shifted away from Larson, as though he were already a corpse. Larson exhaled slowly. He had expected this, and yet the weight of the moment was still notable. Tarwan rose from his seat, hands clasped before him in mock regret. Earth's unchecked ambition cannot be tolerated. You, Ambassador Larson, are no longer a diplomat of a recognized world. You are a representative of a species marked for containment and, ultimately, extermination. The silence that followed was absolute. Larson tilted his head slightly. Extermination. Tarwan nodded. "We've tolerated Earth's ascension long enough. Your kind is dangerous, relentless, and disturbingly efficient. You have gone from scattered tribes to space-faring conquerors in mere centuries. You do not submit. You do not kneel. That makes you a threat." Larson's lips barely parted. "And so you decided to kill me as a warning." Tarwan's expression remained impassive. "The others will follow." The Chancellor lifted a hand, and in that instant, the world around Larson erupted into motion. A high-pitched whine filled the chamber as the turrets charged. Skarn soldiers tightened their grips on their weapons, their trigger fingers twitching. Larson heard it all, his mind processing the movements like pieces of a well-rehearsed dance. He had spent years wearing the face of a diplomat, but before that, before all of this, he had been something else. Something far worse. A split-second decision. Larson's fingers twitched. The first turret locked onto him. He moved. With the grace of a predator, he pivoted just as the first energy bolt lanced toward him, missing his shoulder by a fraction of an inch. His coat flared as he twisted, closing the distance between himself and the nearest guard. His hand lashed out, faster than the eye could follow, seizing the Skarn's wrist. A brutal twist, a sickening pop, and the rifle was his. The chamber erupted into chaos. Larson dropped low as return fire scorched the air above him. The council members scattered, scrambling for cover, some screaming, others frozen in shock. The rifle in his grip felt familiar, its weight reassuring. In one smooth motion, he fired. The blast tore through a second guard's chest, sending the body sprawling backward. A bolt of energy struck his shoulder, sending a jolt of searing heat through his nerves. His armor absorbed the worst of it, but the impact was enough to make his arm go numb for a brief second. He gritted his teeth. Pain could wait. 2 more guards closed in. Larsen's mind assessed trajectories, angles of fire, possible exit points. The walls had no weak spots. The turrets were still active. If he wasted time engaging the guards, he'd be pinned down. A distraction. He needed a distraction. His eyes flicked to the council delegates. In a single fluid movement, Larsen vaulted over the nearest console, firing another precise shot. The blast struck the ceiling's energy nodes, causing a ripple effect through the chamber's lighting. Sparks rained down. Emergency protocols triggered a sudden shift in gravity, just enough to throw the guards off balance. Larsen didn't hesitate. He surged forward, weaving through the chaos, his mind already focused on his next move. But then, the air turned cold. A deep, guttural voice cut through the disorder. Enough. Tarwan. The Chancellor had not fled like the others. Instead, he stood amidst the carnage, his gaze locked on Larsen, unshaken. His fingers twitched slightly, and suddenly, the air itself seemed to tremble. A pulse of energy surged through the chamber, knocking Larsen back. His vision blurred for a moment as an unseen force pinned him against the floor. Tarwan stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. "You thought we did not account for this possibility?" Tarwan mused, his voice almost amused. "We know what you are." Larsen's muscles strained against the invisible hold. His breath came sharp and fast. Tarwan crouched beside him. "You are not just an ambassador." He whispered the words like a secret. "Earth thinks it hides its weapons well, but we have eyes everywhere." Larsen clenched his jaw. His heartbeat slowed, his thoughts sharpening. He had been caught before, captured before, tortured before, and every time they had made the same mistake. They thought he could be contained. Tarwan stood. "This time, there is no escape." Larsen smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was not the smile of a man who had been defeated. "You talk too much," he said softly. The lights flickered, and then everything went dark. Chancellor Lorzer exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening behind his back. "Seal the station," he ordered, his voice cold and measured. "Every docking bay, every corridor. I want security drones deployed immediately." The Drakvar warlord beside him shifted uneasily, his massive frame tense. "You should have killed him the moment he walked through those doors." Tarwan turned his head slightly, his dark eyes narrowing. "Do you think I don't know what he is? I know exactly what I'm dealing with." The warlord's nostrils flared. Then why is he still breathing? Because, Tarwan thought, Larsen had been waiting for this. The attack had not surprised him. The betrayal had not shaken him. Larsen had walked into the council's den fully aware of what would happen, and instead of resisting, he had let it unfold, which meant he had a plan. And now he was loose. A cold dread settled into Tarwan's chest. The council had ruled over hundreds of species for millennia, crushing revolts and bending entire civilizations to its will. It had fought wars against creatures capable of reshaping reality, against mechanical minds that could calculate futures in fractions of a second. And yet, none of that mattered, because they had never fought a human like Larsen. "Find him," Tarwan commanded. The station's intercom crackled to life, broadcasting a sector-wide security alert. But Larsen was already moving. He had slipped through the maintenance corridors, using the brief window of confusion to gain distance. His mind was a precise machine, calculating every detail. The station's layout, the number of guards, the weaknesses in their formations. The suit beneath his shredded diplomat's uniform was not standard issue. It was a custom-fitted tactical exoskeleton, designed to absorb kinetic impacts and enhance his reflexes beyond natural limits. A Skarn enforcer rounded a corner just ahead, scanning the corridor. Larsen did not hesitate. His movements were economical, Precise, 3 strides, a sudden burst of speed, a knife drawn from his sleeve. The alien barely had time to react before the blade entered his throat, silencing him with a wet gurgle. Larson caught the body before it could collapse and dragged it into the shadows. He needed weapons. The security outposts were too heavily guarded, but there was another option. The old military storage wings, long since decommissioned, still held relics of past wars, and he knew exactly where to find them. His path took him through the ventilation shafts, a sprawling network of tunnels originally designed for atmospheric control, but now repurposed as maintenance access points. He moved like a phantom, unseen and unheard, while alarms blared across the station. By the time he reached his destination, the Council's forces had mobilized fully. Squads of armored warriors patrolled the halls, combat drones hovering in coordinated formations. The hunt had begun, but Larson was not the prey. He slipped inside the storage chamber, its interior lined with towering metal crates, relics from past conflicts. His fingers brushed against the cold steel of an old Terran assault rifle, still intact, still lethal. He retrieved extra ammunition, a combat knife, and a set of small explosives, tools of his old life, buried beneath layers of diplomacy. The Council thought they had unmasked him, but in truth, he had been waiting for the moment he could stop pretending. The first kill was always a message. General Vroth, commander of the Skarn battalions, had been among the most vocal advocates for Earth's destruction. He was stationed in the station's war room, overseeing the hunt for Larson with growing frustration. "Status report," he barked. A technician, his elongated fingers dancing over a holographic console, shook his head. "He's evading every perimeter we set. Security drones report malfunctions in sectors 3 and 5. Several guards have gone missing." Vroth slammed his fist against the console, his yellow eyes narrowing. "That's impossible. He's one man." A soft chime interrupted them. A personal message had just been received on Vroth's encrypted communicator. The screen displayed only a few words. "You should have killed me when you had the chance." Vroth barely had time to process it before the power cut out. Total darkness swallowed the war room. The emergency generators should have activated instantly, but they did not. A suffocating silence followed. Then, one by one, the monitors flickered back on. But they no longer displayed security feeds or tactical data. Instead, they showed live footage of the dead. Guards slumped against walls, their weapons still clutched in lifeless hands. Officers with clean, precise bullet wounds to the skull. The corridors painted in shadows and blood. And then, a figure moved. Larson stepped into frame, his expression unreadable, his gaze like a knife. The war room's security detail barely had time to react before the door exploded inward. Smoke and fire swallowed the entrance as Larson moved through the haze, his rifle spitting controlled bursts of destruction. Every shot found its mark. The air filled with the sharp crack of gunfire, the wet thud of bodies hitting the floor. Vroth grabbed for his sidearm, his claws trembling as he raised it. Too slow. Larson was already in front of him. The rifle's barrel pressed against Vroth's chest, its heat seeping through his armor. "Wait." The shot echoed through the war room. Vroth collapsed, his body twitching once before going still. Larson stood over him for a moment, then reached down and activated the war room's central communicator. The council chamber was in chaos. Delegates shouted over one another, panic spreading as reports came in of entire patrols wiped out, entire wings of the station lost. Tarwan watched the madness unfold, his hands tightening behind his back. Then the central screen flickered. Larson's face appeared, his gaze unwavering. The chamber fell silent. "You started this war," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You thought you were in control, that you could decide the fate of my world." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes dark with promise. "You're not the first to make that mistake." The transmission cut. Tarwan's breath was slow, controlled. He turned to his remaining warlords, his voice even. "We are leaving." A Drakvar officer frowned. "Chancellor, the station is already lost." Tarwan did not wait for debate. He turned and walked briskly toward the exit, his mind already calculating his next move. Larson had declared war, but Tarwan would ensure he would not live to finish it. The warship Ebon Judgment hurtled through the void, its engines burning white-hot as it pushed beyond the artificial gravity well of Xeris 9. The council members aboard had abandoned the station the moment Larson turned it into a battlefield. Now they sought refuge in the far reaches of space, where they believed their power and authority would shield them from the storm they had unleashed. But Larson was already with them. Deep in the lower decks, he emerged from a service hatch, his body coiled like a predator ready to strike. He had infiltrated the ship the moment Tarwan and his entourage had made their escape, blending into the chaos as they fled the station. The corridors of the warship were bathed in the eerie glow of emergency lighting, the metallic walls humming with the pulse of the ship's core. He moved with surgical precision, each step calculated, every breath controlled. His presence was not yet known, but that would not last long. The hunt had begun. The first target was Lord Avon Lyr, a high-ranking Elegian diplomat, a creature of silk and shadow who had orchestrated much of the political maneuvering behind the attempt on Larson's life. Lyr was no warrior. His weapons were lies and manipulation. He believed in control through deception, in tightening the strings from the shadows. Larson intended to cut those strings. Lyr's quarters were lavish, a stark contrast to the sterile corridors of the warship. The Elegian preferred decadence even in exile, surrounding himself with floating sculptures, perfumed air, and low, thrumming music designed to soothe the mind. Larson stepped inside without a sound. Lyr was seated before a holographic console, his elongated fingers dancing across the interface. His translucent skin pulsed faintly, the bioluminescent veins beneath his surface shifting in agitation. He was trying to secure a diplomatic lifeline, sending urgent communiques to allies across the galaxy, desperate to salvage the Council's power. Larson waited in the shadows, watching. Avon Lyr was not a fool. His eyes flicked up, sensing something, a shift in the air, a presence that should not be there. His fingers hesitated over the console. "Show yourself," Lyr whispered. Larson stepped forward, the dim light casting sharp angles over his face. Lyr exhaled sharply, his body stiffening. "I knew you would come." Larson said nothing. "You must understand," Lyr continued, his voice a careful melody of persuasion. "This was never personal. The Council acted out of necessity. Earth, your kind, poses a risk to the balance of power." Larson took another step closer. Lyr swallowed. "What do you hope to accomplish?" "The Council is vast. Kill me, and another will rise in my place. Kill us all, and the galaxy will turn against Earth." Larson's expression remained impassive. "I'm not here for speeches." Lyr's face twitched, his attempt at negotiation crumbling under the weight of inevitability. He reached for a concealed energy dagger beneath his desk, but Larson was faster. His knife struck first, slipping between Lyr's ribs with lethal precision. The Elegian shuddered, his glowing veins flickering erratically. His body slumped forward, his final breath leaving him in a whispered sigh. Larson wiped the blade clean and stepped away. One down. The alarm sounded moments later. The warship's security systems registered the unauthorized entry into Lyr's chambers. Red emergency lights bathed the corridors, and within seconds, the vessel's security force mobilized. Larson embraced the chaos. A squad of Skarn enforcers stormed the lower decks, their heavy boots pounding against the grated floors. They moved in coordinated formations, their rifles sweeping through the corridors in precise arcs. Larson took the first one in silence, dropping from an overhead maintenance hatch and snapping the guard's neck in a fluid motion. He retrieved the fallen weapon and vanished into the shadows before the others realized something was wrong. Then, the hunt turned. One by one, he dismantled the security force. Close quarters engagements where his speed and brutality outmatched their armor. Precision shots that ended fights before they even began. The corridors became a graveyard, the walls painted with the aftermath of the massacre. By the time the last enforcer fell, Larson had reached his next target. Admiral Ren Varos, the military strategist responsible for coordinating the Council's forces, had retreated to the ship's command deck, sealing himself within the fortified operations chamber. Unlike Lyr, Varos was a warrior, a man who had earned his reputation through blood and conquest. His species, the Tervani, were bioengineered for combat. Enhanced reflexes, reinforced skeletal structures, rapid muscle regeneration. Larson knew Varos would not run. He would fight. The command deck doors were reinforced, nearly impenetrable without the correct access codes. Larson did not have time for subtlety. Instead, he primed one of the thermal charges he had taken from the station and adhered it to the entrance. The explosion tore through the barriers, sending shards of molten metal cascading into the chamber beyond. Larson stepped through the smoke. Varos was waiting, clad in a modified combat exosuit, his heavy plasma rifle locked and ready. "You've come far, human," Varos rumbled, his voice like grinding stone. "But this is where you fall." Larson's answer was a single gunshot. Varos sidestepped with unnatural speed, the bullet grazing his shoulder. He returned fire, the plasma bolt searing through the space where Larson had been a second earlier. Larson closed the distance. The fight was brutal, unrelenting. Varos was stronger, his enhanced physiology allowing him to absorb blows that would have crippled lesser beings. But Larson was faster, more precise. A parry, a counterstrike, a pivot that placed him just outside of Varos's reach before he delivered a devastating shot to the Admiral's knee. The Tervani stumbled, and in that moment of hesitation, Larson drove his combat knife through the weak point in the exosuit's plating, straight into the base of Varos's skull. The Admiral's body convulsed, then stilled. Larson pulled the blade free. The command deck was his. He accessed the warship's primary systems, overriding the navigation protocols. The vessel was no longer under the Council's control. And then he sent a message, not just to the remaining Council members, but to the entire fleet. A single transmission, no threats, no demands, only footage of the dead, of the Council members who had already fallen, and of Larson himself standing in the command deck, his gaze locked onto the camera, an unspoken promise in his eyes. The transmission cut. On the bridge of the fleeing command vessel, Tarwan watched in silence. His grip on the armrest of his throne-like chair tightened. His warlords stood behind him, their expressions unreadable. One by one, the Council was being erased. Tarwan's pulse remained steady, but the weight in his chest was undeniable. Larson was coming, and there was nothing that would stop him now. The command vessel, Sovereign Bastion, drifted through the vast emptiness of space, its polished hull reflecting the light of distant stars. The last remnants of the Galactic Council had gathered here, their final sanctuary against the force hunting them down. The corridors were lined with heavily armed soldiers, their armor gleaming under the dim glow of emergency lights. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken fear, the weight of inevitability pressing down on every soul aboard. Chancellor Lorzer stood at the heart of the command deck, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. He had ruled from this seat of power for decades, his influence stretching across hundreds of systems. But tonight, that power was meaningless. Larson had made sure of that. The reports had been relentless. One by one, the Council's strongest had fallen. Their warships, their defenses, their elite warriors, none had been enough. Larson was no longer just a diplomat, no longer merely a man seeking vengeance. He had become a force of destruction, moving through the stars like a shadow of death. And now he was here. A soft chime echoed through the bridge. "Chancellor," a voice called, taut with barely concealed panic. "Internal security systems are detecting an unauthorized presence on board." Tarwan did not react immediately. He had expected this. He had known it would come to this. "How did he get in?" he asked, his voice a measured whisper. Silence. The security officer swallowed. "Unknown. We have locked down all critical sectors, doubled the guard rotations. He shouldn't have been able to board." And yet he had. Tarwan exhaled slowly. "Sound the alert." Lock every access point. Deploy combat drones, too. The lights flickered. Then darkness. Every screen, every panel, every power source across the ship cut out at once. For a brief moment, the bridge was plunged into absolute silence, save for the steady breathing of the gathered warlords and officers. Then a voice. Low. Unyielding. You ran. Larson's voice echoed through the emergency speakers, hollow and cold. But you already knew you couldn't hide. The emergency power flickered back on, casting the command deck in a sickly red glow. The officers scrambled to regain control, their fingers flying over the consoles. But it was already too late. Their systems had been compromised. Their ship was no longer theirs. Larson had taken everything. Tarwan turned slowly, his jaw tightening. "Where is he?" he demanded. A sharp, gurgled scream answered. The nearest security officer collapsed, a thin line of red tracing across his throat. The others barely had time to react before the shadows moved again, Larson weaving through them like a phantom. The first soldier who raised his weapon had it torn from his grip, his own arm twisted at an impossible angle before he crumpled to the ground. The second barely managed a strangled gasp before Larson drove a combat knife into his sternum. The bridge erupted into chaos. Gunfire flared, streaks of plasma cutting through the air, but Larson was faster. He danced through the carnage with a predator's grace, disarming, breaking, killing with the efficiency of a being who had long since left behind the constraints of morality. He was not here for a war. He was here for judgment. The last remaining warlord, a towering Drakvar, roared and charged. His strength was formidable, his armored form built for combat, but it did not matter. Larson stepped into the strike, twisted, and drove his elbow into the warlord's throat. The Drakvar staggered, choking, and in that split second, Larson took his rifle and ended it with a single precise shot. Then only Tarwan remained. The Chancellor had not moved. Even as his guards fell, even as the battle unfolded before him, he had stood in absolute stillness. But now he reached for the hidden panel at his side, his fingers activating the last contingency. The floor beneath them shifted. Gravity reversed without warning, sending bodies and debris spiraling upward. The bridge transformed into a war zone of floating wreckage, flickering flames, and shattered steel. Larson twisted midair, adjusting, while Tarwan remained anchored in place, his boots magnetized to the floor. "You think you're unstoppable," Tarwan murmured, watching Larson stabilize himself. "But every man bleeds." He pressed a final command, and the security turrets emerged from hidden compartments in the walls. 12 automated weapons locked onto Larson at once, their targeting systems whirring into place. Larson exhaled. The turrets fired. He moved. The first barrage shredded through the air where he had been a second earlier, scorching the walls. Larson pushed off a floating console, twisting through the storm of gunfire, his mind calculating every trajectory, every fraction of a second that determined survival. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, drawing twin pistols from his belt. One shot. A turret exploded in a shower of sparks. 2 more followed. By the time he landed, half the automated weapons had been reduced to smoking wreckage. Tarwan snarled, his calm facade cracking for the first time. He shed his ceremonial robe, revealing the war armor beneath, a fusion of organic plating and technology, battle-forged and designed for one thing: to kill. Larson stood, his gaze steady. Tarwan lunged. The fight was brutal, unrelenting. Tarwan's strikes carried the strength of his species, blows that could shatter bones. But Larson was faster. He dodged, countered, drove his fist into Tarwan's ribs, feeling the armor crack under the force. Tarwan retaliated with a backhand strike, sending Larson sprawling. The Chancellor seized the moment, drawing a plasma blade from his wrist gauntlet, the weapon humming with lethal energy. He swung. Larson barely avoided the strike, the blade carving through the air inches from his throat. He rolled, grabbed a discarded rifle, and fired point-blank. Tarwan's armor absorbed most of the impact, but the force sent him staggering. Larson pressed the attack, closing the distance. A shift in balance, and he drove his knife into the Chancellor's side, piercing through the gaps in the plating. Tarwan gasped, his eyes widening. Larson stepped closer, twisting the blade. "You wanted to control everything," he murmured, his voice cold. "But in the end, you couldn't even control your own fate." Tarwan's breath shuddered. Larson wrenched the knife free and let the body fall. Silence settled over the bridge, the hum of the failing ship the only sound. The last of the Galactic Council was dead. Larson exhaled and turned to the command console. The ship's systems were failing, critical damage from the battle leaving it adrift. He could leave it to burn in the void, to let it become a forgotten relic swallowed by space. But no, this needed to end on his terms. He initiated the ship's self-destruct sequence. As the alarms blared, Larson made his way to the hangar bay. His stolen stealth fighter awaited, its engines primed. The moment he was aboard, he launched, streaking away from the doomed vessel. Behind him, Sovereign Bastion erupted into a firestorm, the explosion consuming everything. And then there was only the silence of space. Larson sat in the cockpit, watching the flames fade into the distance. The war was over. Earth was safe. But Larson knew the truth. There would always be another war, and he would always be waiting.